Martin Scorsese. What movie did he say that he would make twice as much money on than any other film that he ever created in his life? Shutter Island. He said he'd make twice as much money on that because, how many of you guys have seen Shutter Island? Okay. Because anyone who watched it would have to go back and watch it again once they saw how it ended. Right? Because the whole point is you always interpret certain events in a film according to what you know. And once you understand the full picture, you see the present moment differently. It's the same thing with our life. That the more we understand how God is working in our life, when we look back on it, it's different from how we perceive it otherwise. There's always two ways we can perceive our own life. Just purely cause and effect on a horizontal level, right? Certain things happened in my life that got me to where I am now, versus when we see it from God's point of view, from the vertical, it actually transforms our interpretation of the same events we saw before. So I want to talk to you today about the healing of memory, what it means to have a healed memory. The memory is the most important faculty in the human person. And this might be a little more of a teaching homily rather than just a perfectly constructed homily, because you guys weren't important enough for me to spend hours on this homily preparing it. There weren't enough of you, so I just put it together. But in this, well, that's what really stood out to me in the first reading. Right? Jeremiah, he's experienced this deep betrayal and denouncement, even from, he says, those who were his friends, those who were supposed to protect him and be with him. Everyone is turned against him, and he's crying out to God for help. So it's a very difficult situation. I mean, if you think about times in your life when you just felt like everything you touched was turning to ashes, and you didn't have many people to rely on at a certain time. And yet, in the very midst of this sorrow and confusion and threat to his life, at the same time, he ends it with praise of God. But the Lord is with me. But the Lord is with me like a mighty champion. My persecutors will stumble. They will not triumph. And he ends by declaring that, sing to the Lord, praise the Lord, for he has rescued the life of the poor one from the power of the wicked. So even in the midst of this struggle, he can still praise God because he believes that he will be redeemed from this very difficult situation that he's passing through. And St. Paul, he talks about how there was through one man, sin entered the world, and with sin, death and suffering and tragedy. That he doesn't end there. He says, but even more has the grace of God overcome the transgressions of the one man. That the grace that God gave was so much greater than the suffering that came from the one sin. So again, you can see it through two ways. You can see just the fact of we're in a fallen world, we're living in exile, and things break down. Or you could see it through St. Paul's vision, through Christ, but even in the midst of all that sin and tragedy and suffering, the grace of God is even more abundant. And that's how we can see our lives. We can see our lives cause and effect, the sins that we did or the sins that took place against us, the sufferings we've experienced, just one thing after another. And the question is, have we got to the point where we've actually started to see our entire life through the vision of God? All the ways that God was working silently present with us and redeeming those very events of our life. Because that's the most important faculty, is our memory. And what's interesting is the very purpose of our memory is not to remember facts. The purpose of our memory is to remember trauma. The memory is there to protect us. Or like the guys, they went hiking the other day, the Frassati old heads and new guys, and as they were walking up, they saw a snake, right? And Joe is still traumatized to this moment of snakes because he walked up there. The other guys with him are now traumatized because they've never heard a man scream that loud. And so every time Joe goes walking, he's thinking of snakes. Every time the guys see Joe open his mouth, they're afraid that he might scream again. It's both trauma, right? It's where we've experienced something that we haven't processed yet. And then every time that situation comes up again, we have that same kind of guttural reaction, instinctual reaction. That's actually what PTSD is. PTSD is very traumatic events that have yet to be processed in our mind. And so you think about those. Sometimes I go to the old Frassati house and I see Isaiah working with those little cubes. You know, you have to fit them in the holes in the box, like the circle and the circle and the square and the square. And sometimes he's just trying to put the triangle in the square for a long time and it's just not going through. That's kind of what traumatic memories are. They haven't been processed through. And so Cormac McCarthy, you guys know Cormac McCarthy? Wrote the book The Road. And in that, he's asked one time, what is the mind? I thought it was a really interesting answer. He said, the mind, he goes, you forget what you want to remember, and you remember what you want to forget. Have you guys experienced that? Like, why is it that we forget the good things, and so often we can't let go of the bad things that have happened in our life? We forget what we want to remember, and we remember what we want to forget. That's because the memory is always built around holding on to traumatic events from the past. It's a warning because we always live out of our memory. And we're projecting out of our memory into the future. And that determines how we live in the present moment. You know, I had this experience on my retreat. I was just on a silent retreat. And I realized just like how actually depressed I was at the fact of like so much change. We're going through, ever since I've come to St. Paul's, it's been continual change. I found out only after I came here that the average person lasts in campus ministry in the United States, you know how long it is? 8 months. 8 months. We got to pray for Alberto. I need him longer than 8 months. But it's just a constant turnaround. And I love order. I love ritual. I love stability. I thrive on that. But so every time something breaks down and there's change, especially when it wasn't expected, I always get really afraid. My first instinct is fear. And I was praying on why that is. It's like, well, a lot of things come back to how we were raised, our parents. But when my parents divorced, it went from, when I was 12 years old, a place of stability, right? A place of predictability, to then it was just chaos. And how am I going to take care of myself in the midst of this situation? And as I was praying about that, it became very clear to me the Lord speaking to that place. And he said to me, just as I took care of you when everything else fell apart around you, and in the midst of that led you to where you are now, which is exactly where you're supposed to be. So every time things break down in your life, I'm going to be there in the same way to protect you. And in fact, I want things to break down in your life. Because if they don't, I won't get to take care of you. And there's nothing I want to do more as your father than provide for you. And when I heard that from God, it changed the way not only I was looking at my past, right? Through one man's sin, death entered the world, you could say, through the breakdown of the family, all this, breakdown came into my life. And yet the grace was more. I wouldn't be who I am today, and I wouldn't be where I am today had that breakdown not happened. It was actually the greatest gift. But seeing that past differently, now I can see the present moment differently. And it's okay that I don't have the stability I would naturally want. And then I can relax. So St. John of the Cross, he talks about the 3 faculties of the soul. We have 3 faculties of our soul, and that's the memory, imagination, and will. Memory, imagination, will. And he says that each of the theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, correspond to our 3 faculties of the soul. I know this is getting heady, but this is really important. Which one do you think love goes with? Memory, Memory, will, or imagination? I told you this is a teaching class. We're Baptist today. What? Yeah. Memory. Love, memory. Wrong. Will, yes. What do you think that faith goes with? Memory or imagination? You guys are wrong. This is great. All right. I wish you were playing Hangman right now. I would win. Yeah, exactly. No one would have thought this. I never would have thought this. But faith is actually about the memory. When you look at like Deuteronomy, when Moses brings the people through the desert, he says the biggest word in that is remember. Remember what the Lord did for you. Remember how he led you out of Egypt, how he gave you manna in the desert and water from the rock. Remember what he did. And it says every time that Israel goes into a place of sin, it says they no longer remembered the Lord. They forgot the Lord. And then they began to worship false idols and go down a bad path. So faith is really the rear view mirror of our life. It determines how we look back on our life. And what happens with that is when I have experienced, this is where the perfect love casts out all fear. When I have experienced the voice of God speaking to my past, in whatever suffering or trauma was there, in such a way that I experience his presence, that I experience his love and his grace, then I project into the future through my imagination. And that's what gives me hope. So the theological virtue with our imagination is hope. That the more we look back on our life and say, God was faithful to me then in every one of these ways. I've experienced that in my prayer. I've heard his voice. So I can trust that he will be faithful to me in the future. I'm no longer living out of a PTSD, unprocessed memory and suffering and worry about life. And that's what makes us free to love with the will in the present moment. Because love is in the will. Love is right now. And so someone who was hurt in a relationship once. And so all they think about when they think about relationships is pain and rejection and betrayal. Well, what happens when they meet someone new, you close off, right? So I don't want to happen, what happened in the past to happen again, and I project that in the future. I'm like, you can hurt me just as I was hurt in the past. Therefore, I don't love in the present moment. It's the same thing with God. It's the same thing with our life. When we heal our memory through the grace of God, we project into the future in hope, and it allows us to be open to love in the present moment. Really, love is surrender. I can surrender to God in this present moment. That's what Jeremiah experienced. In the midst of all these people who were trying to destroy him, he could surrender. God will be faithful to me. The God who was faithful to me, I know will be faithful to me. I trust him. So when Jesus tells us, fear no man, do not live by fear, you cannot just will that. We cannot will ourselves to trust God. He doesn't want us to. He wants us to have experienced so profoundly his love and intimacy and protection in our life that to surrender to him is the most natural thing in the world. I know you. I trust you. I can give myself to you. That's a healed memory. And that's exactly what we do at every Mass we come to, where Christ himself, in the midst of the betrayal of his apostles, the abandonment of his apostles, and the rejection of his people, he could take bread and wine and turn it into the greatest act of love that God ever did on this earth. Take this, all of you, and eat of it. This is my body given up for you. This is my blood poured out for you. Do this in remembrance of me. To the degree that we experience Christ's healing effect here in the Eucharist and receiving him into our own body and blood, here. We can remember all the graces, all the ways he was faithful to us in the past, and the ways he'll be faithful to us in the future, and that opens us to receive him right here in the present moment.